Welcome everybody to Plain Sight Docs. If you've been here before, you already know we don't chase monsters hiding in the dark. We talk about the ones standing right in front of us, the ones smiling in photos, shaking hands at church, living right next door. Because sometimes evil doesn't hide, it fits in perfectly. Tonight, we're bringing you 4 stories that look perfectly normal until you start peeling back the layers. 4 places that could be anywhere in America. A gas station glowing under a flickering light. A farmhouse swallowed by fog. A quiet neighborhood where the street lamps hum louder than the people who live there. Each one hides something. Something that slipped right past the eyes of everyone around it. A secret buried not in darkness, but in plain sight. Our first story takes us to a town in the middle of Missouri. Population just a few hundred, where for more than 3 decades, fear wasn't a visitor. It was a resident. A man who walked those streets like he owned them. A man who stole, burned, and terrorized his neighbors, while the law looked the other way. For years, this small town lived under his shadow, until one summer day, they decided to take back their peace, in the only way left to them. This is the town that lived in fear. And after that, we'll uncover 3 more stories where evil didn't wear a mask. It wore a familiar face. So settle in, dim the lights, and remember, sometimes the scariest things are the ones hiding in plain sight. If stories like these keep you up at night, if you find yourself drawn to the quiet corners of human darkness, then you're in the right place. Take a second to hit subscribe, because here at Plain Sight Docs, we don't just tell stories about evil, we find it where it's been hiding in plain sight. The dark. I see. It moves. The shadows. They watch. I cannot. The walls. Whisper. What? The silence. Grows. Here. They. Come. The dark. Night. Falls. Skidmore, Nottoway County, Missouri. To locate it on a map requires effort. To understand its place in the American psyche requires context. A dive into the often unspoken realities of rural life. Picture the heartland. Vast, open skies, arching over endless, undulating fields of corn and soybeans. Landscapes carved by gravel roads and punctuated only by the stark silhouettes of grain elevators and the occasional cluster of silos against the horizon. Skidmore itself, even during its more populated periods, represented the quintessential small town, barely more than a functional crossroads. A handful of weathered brick buildings constituting Main Street, housing the essentials, a post office vital for connection. Perhaps a small bank branch managing local finances, a couple of foundational churches anchoring community faith, and the undeniable social nexus, a tavern known simply and ubiquitously as the D&G. The population count, a number that seemed to fluctuate with agricultural fortunes, but rarely strayed far from 400 souls, underscored its intimacy, or perhaps its insularity. This was the bedrock of agricultural America, a community ostensibly built on the pillars of hard physical labor, unwavering self-reliance, and a deep-seated, almost tribal sense of community, where neighbors weren't just geographically proximate, they were integral threads in a shared, multi-generational tapestry. It was a place where conventional wisdom held, doors went unlocked, keys habitually stayed in ignitions, and the local grapevine served as a potent combination of news bulletin, social regulator, and historical record. In the post-war decades, stretching through the outwardly tranquil 1960s and deep into the often turbulent 1970s, Skidmore should have perfectly epitomized rural safety, a quiet haven seemingly insulated from the crime, conflict, and social upheaval gripping larger, distant cities. But beneath this placid surface, Skidmore was anything but safe. It harbored a malignancy, a homegrown terror that methodically warped its communal identity and poisoned its social well. The town lived collectively under the oppressive shadow of one man, an individual whose name, spoken aloud, became synonymous with pervasive fear, unchecked violence, and a staggering, infuriating impunity. His name was Ken Rex McElroy. McElroy wasn't some external force, an outsider who rode into town bringing chaos. He was intrinsically Skidmore, born and raised within its confines, the youngest child in a sprawling, impoverished family reportedly numbering 15 children. His formal engagement with education ceased abruptly in the 8th grade, marking an early departure from conventional paths. By all reliable accounts, including court records and local testimony, he never held what most inhabitants would recognize as a legitimate, steady job for a single day in his entire adult life. Yet, in stark, baffling paradox, Ken McElroy accumulated significant material wealth, tracts of farmland, herds of livestock, numerous vehicles, farm equipment, an accumulation far exceeding what any honest labor within Skidmore's modest economy could possibly yield. This disparity alone should have raised alarms, but in McElroy's sphere of influence, questions often carried dangerous consequences. His actual profession, the dark engine driving his prosperity, his lifelong undeclared vocation, was predation. His business model wasn't built on commerce or craft. It was constructed purely, brutally on systemic intimidation and relentless theft. Ken McElroy spent the better part of 3 decades not contributing to Skidmore, but actively, systematically terrorizing its residents and those in the surrounding Nottoway County agricultural community. His methods lacked subtlety, eschewing complex schemes for raw, effective brutality and psychological warfare, chillingly predictable in their escalation. The pattern often began with calculated incursions against property, testing the waters, establishing dominance. Perhaps some valuable tools would inexplicably vanish from a farmer's unlocked barn overnight, or a few head of prime cattle would mysteriously disappear from a fenced pasture, leaving behind only bafflingly cut wires. These initial acts served less as enrichment for McElroy, and more as probing attacks, establishing his presence, his reach, and his utter disregard for ownership or boundaries. Then, if the victim showed signs of resistance or dared to voice suspicion, the campaign would escalate. A vital piece of farm machinery, like a combine crucial for the impending harvest, might be found inexplicably sabotaged, its engine damaged beyond easy repair. A suspicious fire, often starting under circumstances defying accidental explanation, might suddenly consume a barn filled with weeks' worth of carefully stored winter hay, representing a devastating economic blow. These weren't random acts, they were targeted messages, brutal warnings against defiance, and if a resident pushed too far, found the courage to formally report these incidents, to identify McElroy to the authorities, to attempt to invoke the protection of the law, that's when McElroy's violence often became terrifyingly direct and deeply personal. Threats weren't whispered suggestions, they were explicit, graphic pronouncements of intended harm. He wouldn't just threaten the accuser directly, leveraging the intimate knowledge common in small towns. He'd casually mention their spouse by name, detail the route their children took walking home from school, comment on a vulnerability known only to neighbors. He knew where they lived, the layout of their farms, their daily routines. The fear he meticulously cultivated wasn't just the primal fear of physical assault. It was a deeper, more corrosive psychological dread, targeting the foundational vulnerabilities of family, safety, and future security. He made them feel watched, isolated, and utterly helpless. There was no clandestine secret society orchestrating this reign of terror from the shadows. The societies that enabled and amplified McElroy's dominance was his own sprawling, fiercely loyal, and often equally intimidating family clan. He rarely operated or even appeared in public alone. He was perpetually flanked by his much younger wife, Trina, and a rotating phalanx of his numerous children, siblings, cousins, and other assorted relatives. Trina herself stood as a living monument to his methods. He had notoriously initiated his relationship with her when she was merely 14, legally a child, effectively seizing her at gunpoint from her then-husband. Another local man, McElroy, had already cowed into fearful submission through prior acts of violence and intimidation. Her presence beside him was a constant, silent testament to his power and brutality. This extended family functioned seamlessly as his personal shield, his auxiliary enforcers, his silent, watchful army. When McElroy perceived an insult or faced a challenge, dozens of his relatives might suddenly materialize, seemingly out of nowhere. They'd silently fill a local store where the offending party worked or shopped, not buying, not speaking, just standing, watching, their collective, unblinking presence generating an atmosphere of suffocating menace, until the intended message was received, and the complaint inevitably withdrawn. They'd engage in blatant acts of vehicular intimidation, trailing a farmer's truck down miles of unlit, desolate county roads, late at night, headlights aggressively burning in the rearview mirror, a constant, nerve-shredding reminder of who truly controlled the territory beyond the town limits. Through these coordinated tactics, they systematically transformed Skidmore, this supposedly idyllic slice of small-town America, into an oppressive open-air prison camp, where the self-appointed warden was one of their own neighbors. Faced with such pervasive terror, where could the citizens turn? What about the official mechanisms of justice, the sheriff's department, the county prosecutor, the courts? Against the entrenched power and ruthless methods of Ken McElroy, these institutions proved tragically, consistently, almost laughably impotent. Over a span encompassing roughly 2 decades, official records document that McElroy faced formal indictment after indictment. Reliable sources confirm at least 21 separate instances where serious felony charges were brought against him by county or state authorities. The sheer breadth of the alleged offenses paints a portrait of a career criminal operating with breathtaking impunity. Aggravated assault, often involving firearms, burglary of homes and businesses, arson targeting barns, crops, and rivals' property, systematic livestock rustling across multiple counties, credible allegations of statutory rape involving underage girls, sickening accusations of child molestation, and even attempted murder. Yet despite this staggering litany of formal charges, despite numerous arrests and court appearances, the outcome was maddeningly consistent. McElroy walked free, never convicted on a felony charge, never serving significant prison time that would remove him from the community he terrorized. How could such a blatant failure of justice persist for so long? The answer wasn't complex, hidden in legal intricacies. It was crude, simple, and brutally effective. Witness tampering. Relentless, systematic, and utterly terrifying witness intimidation. Every single time the local authorities, often spearheaded by the few brave souls within the system like Sheriff Danny Estes, managed to painstakingly build a case strong enough to withstand preliminary motions and proceed towards a jury trial, something invariably, predictably happened to the crucial witnesses needed to secure a conviction. Their memories would suddenly conveniently fail on the stand. Their initial confident identifications would dissolve into uncertainty. Their resolve to testify, often forged in anger or desperation, would evaporate under the chilling pressure McElroy and his clan expertly applied. Fear delivered through direct threats, property destruction, or the suffocating presence of his extended family, consistently proved a more potent, more immediate force than abstract notions of civic duty, or the distant promises of legal protection. The case of Jack Matthews serves as a stark illustration. A local farmer, Matthews had the misfortune of directly confronting McElroy in the act of stealing valuable grain from his storage bins. Unlike many others, Matthews reported the theft and agreed to testify. Charges were filed. A trial date loomed. The night immediately preceding his scheduled court appearance, shotgun blast shattered the nighttime quiet outside Matthews' isolated farmhouse. Pellets peppered the siding, breaking windows, but injuring no one. The message, however, was delivered with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. The following morning, visibly shaken and pale on the witness stand, Matthews faltered. His initial certainty vanished. He told the court his memory of the event was now hazy, clouded by darkness and confusion. He could no longer definitively swear it was McElroy he had seen that night. Without its key witness, the prosecution's case collapsed. Charges dismissed. Consider also the experience of James Hartman, another Skidmore resident, who possessed the rare courage, or perhaps reckless desperation, to follow through and testify against McElroy in a separate legal proceeding. Within a week of his court appearance, Hartman's large essential hay barn, representing not just stored feed, but a significant portion of his agricultural capital, inexplicably erupted in flames late one night. It burned completely to the ground, a devastating financial blow. While arson investigators could find no definitive proof linking McElroy directly, the timing and context left no doubt in the minds of Skidmore residents. Everyone understood it was retaliation, a brutal object lesson broadcast to the entire community. The message resonated deeply and effectively. Testify against Ken McElroy, defy his authority, and you will pay a terrible price. He wouldn't just strike at your physical safety. He would systematically dismantle your livelihood, your ability to survive and provide for your family. He crude effectiveness of direct intimidation. McElroy wielded another, seemingly paradoxical weapon in his arsenal. Beyond exceptionally sophisticated and expensive legal representation, he retained the full services of Richard McFadden, a legal powerhouse based in Kansas City, widely regarded as one of the most skilled, aggressive, and consequently costly defense attorneys in the entire region. The enduring mystery, the subject of constant, hushed speculation throughout Nottoway County, was how McElroy, a man with no visible means of legitimate income, known primarily for theft and bullying, consistently afforded McFadden's astronomical legal fees, which surely ran into the hundreds of thousands of dollars over the decades. Theories abounded, involving hidden caches of stolen goods, laundered money from large-scale rustling operations, or even secret benefactors within the county who found McElroy useful, but concrete proof remained elusive. Regardless of the source of the funds, afford him McElroy did, and McFadden proved himself worth every penny, operating as a master tactician within the complexities of the legal system. McFadden's defense strategy was remarkably consistent, honed over years of representing McElroy, and brutally effective. Upon learning of McElroy's arrest, regardless of the charge, McFadden would immediately unleash a meticulously prepared barrage of pre-trial motions. A primary tactic was invariably a request for a change of venue. He would argue, often persuasively, that the pervasive negative publicity surrounding McElroy made it impossible for him to receive a fair trial from an impartial jury within Nottoway County. This often succeeded in moving trials to adjacent, sometimes more remote, counties, significantly inconveniencing local witnesses, and potentially placing them in environments where they felt even more isolated and susceptible to McElroy's off-the-record influence. Simultaneously, McFadden would file exhaustive motions to suppress crucial pieces of prosecution evidence, challenging search warrants, interrogation procedures, witness identifications, anything that could potentially weaken the state's case on technical grounds. He was relentless in challenging the presiding judges as well. If a judge seemed inclined to issue rulings unfavorable to McElroy, McFadden wouldn't hesitate to file motions demanding the judge's recusal, alleging bias or prejudice, further delaying proceedings and muddying the legal waters. McFadden skillfully, cynically, exploited every available loophole, every procedural safeguard designed to protect the innocent, twisting them into offensive weapons to shield his demonstrably guilty client. He effectively turned the intricate machinery of the justice system against itself, grinding prosecutions to a halt through delay, obstruction, and technicality. The combined effect of McFadden's brilliant legal obstructionism in the courtroom and McElroy's terrifying campaign of witness intimidation on the ground created a near impenetrable shield of impunity. Ken McElroy became, for all practical purposes, untouchable. He operated not merely above the law, but seemingly entirely outside its reach, a walking, breathing affront to the very concept of justice in the small, tightly knit world of Skidmore. This prolonged, systemic failure of the legal system to address McElroy's escalating criminality bred a deep, corrosive cynicism within the community, a growing sense that they were utterly abandoned, left to fend for themselves against a predator the law could not, or would not, stop. The fuse of community resentment, helplessness, and ultimately, rage, burned shorter with each passing year, with each dismissed charge, with each act of unpunished violence. But even long-established patterns can be broken. In the hot, humid summer of 1980, the dynamic that had held Skidmore captive for so long finally began to fracture. Perhaps it was, as some later speculated, simply decades of unchecked impunity finally breeding a fatal carelessness in McElroy, a profound arrogance that led him to underestimate a potential victim. Or perhaps it was simply the random intersection of his ingrained predatory behavior with an individual less easily intimidated than most. Whatever the reason, the catalyst for the final bloody chapter wasn't one of McElroy's typically brazen felonies, not arson, not assault, not large-scale theft. It was, almost surreally, a minor act of shoplifting involving a piece of cheap candy. At the heart of Skidmore's modest town square stood the B&B Grocery, a cornerstone of the community, owned and operated for years by Ernest Bo Bowenkamp, a widely respected town elder, then approaching his 70th birthday, known for his quiet demeanor and integrity, alongside his wife Lois. Like many small family businesses, their teenage daughter, Mary, routinely helped out at the store after school, managing the register or stocking shelves. One unremarkable afternoon, Mary observed Ken McElroy, a familiar and imposing figure in the small store, casually pocket a piece of candy, an item worth perhaps 50 cents, and head towards the exit without any intention of paying. Unlike countless other Skidmore residents who over the years had learned through bitter experience that directly confronting McElroy over any transgression, however minor, was simply too dangerous, Mary acted, whether driven by youthful naivete regarding the true depth of McElroy's menace, or simply by an ingrained, straightforward sense of right and wrong instilled by her parents. She challenged him. She calmly but firmly asked him to pay for the item he had taken. For a man like Ken McElroy, whose entire identity and sense of power were built upon unquestioned dominance and the ability to take whatever he desired without consequence, this small, public act of defiance by a teenage girl was utterly intolerable. It wasn't about the monetary value of the candy. It was a fundamental challenge to his carefully constructed aura of untouchability, an affront delivered in his own territory. In his dangerously warped perception, Mary Bowenkamp's simple request for payment was received not as a minor correction, but as a profound insult, an act of rebellion, tantamount to a declaration of war against his authority. The repercussions were swift and terrifying. That same evening, the simmering tension ignited. The telephone rang ominously at the Bowenkamp residence. Lois answered, perhaps expecting a call from a neighbor or supplier. Instead, she heard the voice of Trina McElroy, Ken's young wife, often used as a reluctant mouthpiece for his threats. Trina relayed a transparently fabricated story, claiming her own daughter had accused Mary Bowenkamp of insulting her, of calling her bad names earlier that day. Lois, understanding the subtext, calmly but firmly denied the accusation, reiterating that Mary had merely intervened during an act of shoplifting. Trina's reply, delivered likely under duress but chilling nonetheless, stripped away any remaining pretense. Ken, she stated flatly, is coming to visit your daughter. Mary. Then the line went dead. The threat, delivered obliquely through his wife but clearly originating from McElroy himself, was unambiguous, deeply personal, and utterly terrifying in its implications. Lois Bowenkamp, unlike so many previous victims paralyzed into inaction by McElroy's menacing reputation, did not hesitate. Understanding the immediate mortal danger her daughter potentially faced, she acted decisively. She immediately called the one figure in local authority who had consistently, albeit often unsuccessfully, demonstrated the courage to confront McElroy directly. Nottoway County Sheriff Danny Estes. Estes, a younger, more modern lawman compared to his predecessors, represented perhaps the last bastion of formal opposition to McElroy's reign within the county. He grasped the gravity of Trina's thinly veiled threat instantly. His instructions to Lois were stark and urgent. Lock every door and window. Do not engage if McElroy appears. He promised he was on his way. Estes, exhibiting considerable bravery given McElroy's known volatility and hatred for law enforcement, first drove directly to McElroy's remote farmhouse. He confronted McElroy face to face, issuing a direct, official warning, stay away from the Bowenkamp family. Any attempt to harass or harm them would be met with immediate arrest. McElroy, reportedly fueled by alcohol and incandescent rage over the shoplifting incident, reacted with characteristic contempt and violence. He allegedly laughed derisively in the sheriff's face, utterly dismissing his authority. Eyewitness accounts and later testimony detailed McElroy's chilling direct threat to the sheriff himself. "Sheriff," he reportedly snarled, "I'll give you one free shot. After that, I'm going to kill you." Then, underlining his deadly intent, McElroy stormed into his house, emerged moments later brandishing his ever-present shotgun, climbed into his formidable pickup truck, and roared off towards town, clearly heading for Bo Bowenkamp's grocery store. Bo was working late, alone in the store's small back office, likely reconciling the day's receipts when McElroy arrived. There was no knock, no warning. McElroy kicked the office door clean off its hinges, the wood splintering violently. He stood framed in the doorway, a menacing silhouette against the dim light of the store, leveling his shotgun directly at the elderly store owner's face. "I'm going to kill your daughter," McElroy repeated, his voice filled with venom. Bo Bowenkamp, despite facing imminent death, somehow found the courage to stand his ground. "McElroy," he replied, his voice reportedly steady despite the circumstances, "you are not." Perhaps surprised by the old man's defiance, McElroy smirked, his finger tightening on the trigger. He pulled. A sharp, metallic click echoed in the tense silence of the small office. In his blind, alcohol-fueled rage, McElroy had made a critical, almost comical error. He had forgotten to disengage the shotgun's safety mechanism. In that single, critical second of McElroy's stunned confusion, the 70-year-old Bo Bowenkamp, acting purely on instinct and a surge of adrenaline, lunged forward. He grappled with the much larger, younger man, somehow managing to wrench the loaded shotgun away from him. Utterly humiliated, disarmed by an elderly man he intended to terrorize, McElroy scrambled backward, stumbled out of the store, and fled ignominiously into the night. The following morning, armed with Bo Bowenkamp's credible testimony, physical evidence of the forced entry, and the recovered shotgun, authorities finally had what seemed like an airtight case. Ken McElroy was arrested and formally charged with felony assault and attempted murder. A collective sigh of relief, fragile yet palpable, swept through Skidmore. Could this finally be it? After decades of living under his shadow, could the reign of terror finally be drawing to a close? Was the town's monster, caught in a clear and undeniable act of violence, finally headed to prison where he belonged? They allowed themselves a flicker of hope, unaware that the legal system, McElroy's longtime, unwitting enabler, had one last devastating betrayal in store. A decision that would extinguish that hope and inexorably push the long-suffering town towards its final violent solution. Hartman's large, essential hay barn, representing not just stored feed, but a significant portion of his agricultural capital, inexplicably erupted in flames late one night. It burned completely to the ground, a devastating financial blow. While arson investigators could find no definitive proof linking McElroy directly, the timing and context left no doubt in the minds of Skidmore residents. Everyone understood it was retaliation, a brutal object lesson broadcast to the entire community. The message resonated deeply and effectively. Testify against Ken McElroy, defy his authority, and you will pay a terrible price. He wouldn't just strike at your physical safety, he would systematically dismantle your livelihood, your ability to survive and provide for your family. The brutal saga of Skidmore, Missouri, culminated in a shocking act of communal vigilantism, a public execution born from decades of terror and systemic failure. It was a prison forged by the fear of one man, ultimately shattered by the collective will of a town pushed beyond its limits by violence and the utter collapse of legal recourse. The silence that followed the gunshots on Main Street was not just the absence of noise. It was a pact, a grim resolution by a community that chose self-preservation over judicial process when the system itself had proven impotent. But our second case delves into a different, perhaps even more insidious and psychologically complex form of captivity. This is not a prison enforced primarily by shotguns and overt physical threats, but one built meticulously, brick by ideological brick, within the very minds of its captives. It's the story of a community taken hostage, not merely by a single violent bully demanding compliance, but by a singular, all-consuming worldview, embodied by a man they didn't just fear, they revered him, worshipped him, as a living conduit to God, a prophet whose every utterance was divine law. This is the chilling narrative of a town that willingly, even eagerly, surrendered its individual autonomy, its familial bonds, its connection to the outside world, and ultimately its moral compass, to the absolute, suffocating control of a self-proclaimed holy man. We journey now to the starkly beautiful, yet deeply isolated borderlands straddling Utah and Arizona. Here lie the twin communities known locally, and with a certain ominous weight, simply as the Creek. Legally designated as Hilldale, Utah and Colorado City, Arizona, these towns function as a single, contiguous entity, deliberately separated geographically, culturally, and ideologically from the mainstream of American life. Even a casual drive through the Creek today evokes an immediate sense of profound otherness, a feeling of having stepped not just off the main highway, but perhaps out of time itself. The breathtaking backdrop of towering Vermilion cliffs and the vast, sun-drenched expanse of the high desert clashes jarringly, almost surreally, with the human landscape below. Streets are often unnervingly quiet, public parks eerily deserted. The architecture itself feels alien, block after block lined with massive, often perpetually unfinished, pale plywood houses, constructed on a scale clearly intended to accommodate families of staggering size, lending the entire area the distinct, unsettling air of a tightly controlled compound, rather than an organic community. And then there are the people, instantly recognizable and visually arresting. The women and girls, almost exclusively, are clad in modest, deliberately anachronistic, pastel-colored prairie dresses, their designs seemingly lifted from the 19th century. Their hair is meticulously, uniformly styled in intricate, symbolic braids, specific styles often mandated by religious decree, signifying marital status, age, or position within the intricate social hierarchy. This isn't a historical reenactment staged for tourists. This is the enforced reality of daily life. This is a community deliberately, defiantly, frozen in a self-imposed time warp. This is the geographic and spiritual heartland, the primary stronghold of the fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, known globally by the stark acronym FLDS. The FLDS represents one of the largest, most enduring, and undeniably most controversial expressions of fundamentalist Mormonism. Their historical schism from the mainstream Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, headquartered in Salt Lake City, occurred over a century ago. The primary irreconcilable point of divergence was the practice of plural marriage, or polygamy. While the mainstream LDS Church officially renounced polygamy in 1890, issuing the famous manifesto under intense legal and political pressure from the U.S. government seeking Utah's statehood, splinter groups like the FLDS vehemently refused to abandon the practice. For them, polygamy wasn't merely a historical artifact or a permissible lifestyle. It was the central, non-negotiable tenet, the celestial law revealed by God to founder Joseph Smith, absolutely essential for achieving the highest degree of exaltation and glory in the afterlife, the celestial kingdom. Within the FLD's worldview, a man's spiritual standing, his worthiness before God, and his eternal progression were inextricably linked to the number of wives he righteously took, and the multitude of children he fathered. Plural marriage wasn't a choice. It was presented as a divine commandment, the cornerstone of their faith. For decades, the secluded, intertwined communities of the Creek operated under a unique and absolute theocratic structure. All authority, both spiritual and temporal, resided in the figure of the prophet, a single man, invariably elderly, believed by followers to be God's living mouthpiece on earth. His pronouncements, whether on matters of doctrine, marriage assignments, business dealings, or even minute details of daily life, were not considered mere guidance. They were received as direct revelations from God, carrying the weight of divine law, superseding any secular constitution, statute, or individual conscience. From the mid-1980s until his death in the early 2000s, this pivotal role was held by Rulon Jeffs, known almost universally within the tightly knit community as Uncle Rulon. By numerous accounts from former members and observers, Rulon Jeffs ruled with a firm, patriarchal hand, relentlessly reinforcing the community's strict isolation from the perceived evils and corrupting influences of the Gentile outside world, a category that included not only non-Mormons, but also members of the mainstream LDS Church. He himself embodied the principle of plural marriage on a grand scale, accumulating dozens of wives, some, according to later testimonies, disturbingly young when sealed to him, and fathering scores, possibly hundreds of children, thereby setting the expected standard for his male followers. However, when contrasted with the reign that would tragically follow, Rulon Jeffs' era is often retrospectively described by former members as relatively benign, perhaps even predictable. While his control was absolute, his focus seemed primarily directed towards maintaining doctrinal purity and communal separation, rather than exercising the kind of granular, micromanaging, and psychologically devastating control over individual lives that would later define the FLDS under his successor. The entire economic ecosystem and social structure of the Creek rested upon a unique, communally based entity known as the United Effort Plan, or UEP Trust. Established back in the 1940s as a way to manage communal assets and provide for the welfare of church members according to priesthood direction, the UEP eventually grew to hold legal title to virtually everything of material value within the community's expanding domain. Every sprawling residential compound, every local business from construction firms to grocery stores, every productive acre of land within Hilldale and Colorado City, individual FLDS members, even prominent ones, technically owned nothing personally. Their right to occupy a specific house, their employment opportunities within church-controlled businesses, their very permission to reside within the community's borders were granted by the prophet, operating through the legal mechanism of the UEP Trust. And just as easily, swiftly, and arbitrarily as these privileges were granted, they could be revoked. A word from the prophet could instantly render a large family homeless, jobless, and destitute, cast out with nothing. This absolute economic leverage served as a powerful, ever-present tool for ensuring unwavering obedience and discouraging any hint of dissent. In the late summer of 2002, specifically September 8th, Rulon Jeffs died, reportedly just days shy of his 93rd birthday. His passing, while perhaps not unexpected given his advanced age, immediately created a significant power vacuum and plunged the hermetically sealed world of the FLDs into a period of intense uncertainty and behind-the-scenes maneuvering. Tens of thousands of devout followers across multiple interconnected communities in Utah, Arizona, Texas, South Dakota, and even Canada, waited with bated breath, seeking divine confirmation. Who among Rulon's potential successors had God chosen to be the next prophet, seer, and revelator, the sole individual authorized to lead the faithful and interpret celestial law? The succession, when it was finally announced, fell perhaps surprisingly to many outsiders, and even some insiders, not upon one of Rulon's more publicly prominent, politically connected, or seemingly charismatic sons who had vied for influence during Rouland's declining years. Instead, the mantle descended upon a much quieter, less assuming, almost administratively focused figure, Rouland's 50-something son, Warren Steed Jeffs. Warren's primary public role within the complex FLDS hierarchy prior to his ascension had been as the principal of Alta Academy, the community's private, unaccredited K-12 school system. This institution served the critical function of indoctrinating FLDS children in church doctrine, while simultaneously isolating them from secular education and outside influences. He was known primarily as an administrator, a stern enforcer of his father's established rules and rigid standards of conduct, but not necessarily perceived as a natural leader possessing the spiritual gravitas or prophetic charisma expected of the church's highest office. Consequently, many within the community likely anticipated his leadership would usher in a period of administrative consolidation, a continuation of the existing status quo, perhaps even a slight moderation following Rouland's long and increasingly frail tenure. They could not possibly have been more catastrophically wrong. The FLD's community, in accepting Warren Jeffs as their divinely appointed prophet, had just handed absolute, unquestioned spiritual and temporal authority, the power to dictate eternal salvation, command marriages, control livelihoods, interpret God's will without challenge, and demand total obedience to a man whose latent hunger for absolute control would prove pathologically boundless, whose deep-seated paranoia would systematically twist religious doctrine into sophisticated tools of psychological oppression, and whose subsequent reign would plunge the community into an unprecedented era of pervasive fear, systematic abuse, and profound darkness. Warren Jeffs didn't merely inherit his father's position. He methodically set about transforming the FLDs from a secluded religious community into his own personal fiefdom, a theocratic dictatorship built upon the cornerstones of absolute obedience, constant surveillance, and devastating psychological terror. His very first priority upon consolidating his claim as the newly ordained prophet was to dramatically reinforce and expand the walls around his kingdom, both the physical barriers separating the creek from the outside world, and, more importantly, the psychological ramparts isolating his followers' minds. The outside world, the Gentile influence, which included everyone not FLDs, even mainstream Mormons, was declared not just undesirable or spiritually dangerous, but an active, aggressive poison, a spiritual contagion capable of damning souls upon mere contact. Any connection, however tenuous, a non-FLDS relative, a secular radio station, a forbidden book, was deemed a potential vector for this spiritual disease and therefore strictly prohibited. The edicts, presented as divine revelations received directly by Jeffs, cascaded down rapidly, targeting anything perceived as a potential source of worldly pleasure, independent thought, or unapproved information. Television, already severely restricted under Rouland, was now completely banned from homes. Internet access, limited as it had been, became forbidden territory, disconnecting followers almost entirely from external news and perspectives. Movies, popular music, particularly rock and roll, seen as inherently demonic, even previously permitted forms of recreational dancing at weddings or community events, were all declared sinful distractions, outlawed under penalty of severe spiritual and temporal consequences. Public libraries within the community were meticulously purged of any books, magazines, or materials not explicitly approved by Jeffs and his inner circle, effectively creating an information desert. Jeffs's obsession with absolute control, his need to regulate every facet of existence, extended even to the simplest, most innocent forms of communal joy and childhood recreation. He ordered the immediate closure of existing community parks within Hilldale and Colorado City. Playground equipment, the swings, slides, jungle gyms where children had played for generations, was physically dismantled, removed, and reportedly destroyed, deemed frivolous and potentially encouraging of unsupervised, ungodly interactions. In one particularly chilling and widely reported display of his absolute authority and increasingly erratic pronouncements, he commanded that the town's small, beloved community-run petting zoo be completely eliminated. According to numerous accounts from former residents, the animals, goats, sheep, perhaps some fowl, were systematically euthanized, justified by Jeffs as representing an unhealthy, sentimental attachment to worldly creatures, a distractions diverting followers from their required complete devotion to God, and by extension, to his sole representative on earth, the prophet Warren Jeffs. Perhaps the most visually symbolic, internationally recognized, and pervasively enforced of his new constellation of rules was the banning of the color red. Jeffs decreed, again presented as divine revelation, that the color red held profound sacred significance, representing the atoning blood of Jesus Christ, and was therefore far too holy for mortal use in everyday clothing, household items, or even vehicles. Anyone seen wearing red or even possessing significant red items was immediately suspect, marked as potentially rebellious, prideful, or spiritually unclean. Within weeks of this edict, the already muted color palette of the Creek community drained even further into drab conformity. Women diligently stitched new wardrobes of prairie dresses in the limited range of prescribed pastel shades, primarily pale blue, dusty rose, prairie tan, light gray, and white. Men's simple, solid-colored shirts followed suit. Red vehicles, a source of pride for some families, were hastily repainted. Red toys, if not discarded, vanished from sight. The visual uniformity imposed was stark, absolute, extending even to the shades permitted for houses built under the UEP. The town became a muted, controlled landscape, its visual monotony reflecting the relentless suppression of individual expression and the pervasive atmosphere of fear under the prophet's ever-watchful judgmental eye. It wasn't just a community. It was becoming a prison meticulously painted in shades of beige and pale blue. But controlling clothing, recreation, and the color palette were merely surface-level manifestations of domination. Warren Jeffs understood, perhaps intuitively, perhaps through calculated study of authoritarian regimes, that true, lasting, unshakable control required severing the most fundamental human bonds, the deep primal loyalties between spouses, between parents and children. He needed to break the natural family unit and reforge those loyalties, directing them solely, absolutely, towards himself as the prophet. His primary weapon in this sophisticated campaign of psychological warfare was the terrifying, unpredictable, and utterly arbitrary power of marital and familial reassignment. Under the previous leadership of his father Rulon, while the prophet ultimately directed all plural marriage assignments as God's will, there existed a certain semblance, however fragile, of permanence and stability within established family units. If a man remained faithful, obedient, paid his tithes, and fulfilled his priesthood duties, he could generally expect to retain the wives and children given to him by God through the prophet's authority. Warren Jeffs systematically shattered that fragile sense of security, replacing it with pervasive anxiety and constant, gnawing uncertainty. Under his increasingly paranoid and autocratic rule, no one, regardless of their perceived standing or history of loyalty, was truly safe from sudden devastating upheaval. Loyalty was not a fixed state, but something constantly tested, measured, and judged by Jeffs alone, and failure, or even perceived failure, meant instantaneous, utter familial, and social destruction. The mechanism for enforcing this control was brutally efficient and psychologically devastating. Jeffs would announce, often abruptly during sermons or private priesthood meetings, that he had received a revelations directly from God concerning a particular male member of the community. This revelation invariably declared the targeted man unworthy, unrighteous, or contaminated by some form of spiritual transgression. The alleged offenses could range from documented instances of doctrinal disagreement or questioning of Jeffs's pronouncements to perceived personal slights, violations of minute rules, or simply falling out of the prophet's ever-shifting personal favor. This divine declaration instantly branded the man an apostate, a spiritual traitor beyond redemption within the FLDS framework. Excommunication from the church was immediate, absolute, and irreversible without Jeffs's explicit, and rarely granted, forgiveness. However, within the closed, totalitarian ecosystem of the FLDS world, excommunication carried consequences far exceeding mere spiritual banishment. Because the UEP Trust, now firmly under Warren Jeffs's dictatorial control, held legal title to the man's home, the spiritual decree simultaneously rendered him homeless. Because the trust also controlled nearly all significant local employment, construction companies, farms, manufacturing workshops, retail stores, the excommunicated man was instantly jobless, often with only the clothes on his back, perhaps forbidden even from saying goodbye to his family. The condemned man would be forcibly escorted by church securities to the outskirts of the community, sometimes driven hundreds of miles away to distant cities like Las Vegas or Salt Lake City, and summarily abandoned on the side of the highway or at a bus station, utterly severed from everything and everyone he had ever known. This ruthless practice, dramatically escalated under Warren Jeffs, created the tragic and widely publicized phenomenon known as the Lost Boys. Estimates vary, but likely hundreds, possibly thousands of young men, and sometimes older, established patriarchs, were systematically cast out over the years of Jeffs's reign. Their alleged transgressions were often minor, sometimes entirely fabricated. Frequently, younger men were expelled simply because they were perceived by Jeffs and his inner circle as potential rivals for the limited pool of available young brides, desired by older, more powerful men within the hierarchy. These expelled individuals were left to navigate the bewildering, wicked outside world, a world they had been taught to fear and despise. Typically possessing only an 8th grade FLDS education, no marketable job skills, no financial resources, no identification, and no social support network whatsoever. Their only crime, in many instances, was being born male in a system that valued females primarily as reproductive assets, and viewed surplus males as inconvenient competition. The plight of the Lost Boys, abandoned and struggling to survive in a hostile world, was undeniably tragic. Yet, the fate reserved for the families they were forcibly torn from was, in many ways, even more psychologically horrifying, representing a deeper level of systemic abuse. Once a man was branded an apostate and expelled, Warren Jeffs would then immediately exercise his absolute prophetic authority to unilaterally reassign the man's entire family unit, all his wives, regardless of their number or duration of marriage, and all his children, regardless of their age or paternal bond, to another man within the community. This reassignment was presented not as a social arrangement, but as a direct command from God, necessary for the spiritual salvation of the wives and children, now unprotected due to the husband's alleged wickedness. The man chosen to receive the reassigned family was invariably someone deemed more loyal, more obedient, more useful to Warren Jeffs and his consolidation of power. Often, wives were reassigned to much older men already possessing numerous wives, effectively becoming low-status additions to large, complex households. Consider the sheer psychological terror embedded in this practice. A woman could conceivably go to bed one night married to one man, the established father of her children, her partner for years or even decades, and wake up the following morning to be informed, often bluntly and without recourse, that due to a revelation received by the prophet, she was now spiritually sealed to another man entirely, perhaps a near stranger, perhaps someone she disliked or even feared, perhaps one of the prophet's aging inner circle. Her children, similarly, were instantly ripped away from their biological father, often told in harsh terms that their dad was wicked, damned to hell, and that they must now obey and honor their new priesthood head without question. These reassignments weren't suggestions or proposals subject to consent. They were presented as immutable divine commands. Any hesitation, any expression of grief or resistance by the wives or older children, was interpreted as rebellion against God's will, potentially leading to their own excommunication, separation from their remaining family members, and consignment to spiritual damnation. Warren Jeffs wielded this devastating power over family structure with calculated ruthlessness. He systematically shattered families not just as punishment, but as a proactive tool of social control. Women and children became commodities, pawns in his complex game of power, distributed as rewards to his most sycophantic followers, confiscated from those whose loyalty wavered. The constant, looming threat of arbitrary reassignment served as a powerful, ever-present object lesson for the entire community. Questioning the prophet, harboring doubts, even failing to display sufficient enthusiasm for his pronouncements, carried the potential, immediate price of losing everything that mattered most: one's spouse, one's children, one's home, one's community, and according to FLDS doctrine, one's eternal salvation. And who could possibly intervene against such a system operating under the guise of religious freedom? Reporting these egregious human rights abuses, these forced rearrangements of families, to the local police was worse than futile. It was actively dangerous. The police forces of Hilldale and Colorado City, the infamous God Squad, were not impartial enforcers of state and federal law. They were comprised entirely of devout, practicing polygamist FLDS men, often directly related to the church leadership, all appointed or approved with the prophet's blessing. Their primary, unwavering loyalty was not to any secular constitution or legal code, but solely to Warren Jeffs, God's supposed representative. They functioned in practice as the church's private security force, the paramilitary wing of the theocracy. Their duties included enforcing the prophet's myriad edicts, intimidating potential dissenters, surveilling community members, facilitating the expulsion of apostates, and ensuring that the community remained hermetically sealed off from any meaningful outside scrutiny or intervention. Calling 911 within the creek to report an abuse originating from the church leadership often meant reporting the problem directly to the loyal enforcers of the very system perpetrating the harm, inviting retaliation rather than relief. Warren Jeffs constructed his prison through meticulous psychological manipulation, leveraging absolute faith and the threat of familial destruction to maintain control within an isolated, religiously homogeneous community. He weaponized doctrine, banned color, and crushed dissent internally. Our third case study presents a dramatically different, yet equally chilling, manifestation of a community taken hostage. This group didn't primarily operate through fear of damnation, but through audacious displays of wealth, sophisticated political maneuvering, intellectual arrogance, and ultimately, a shocking willingness to employ violence, not just against individuals, but against an entire unsuspecting population. This group didn't seek refuge in isolation. They sought to build an empire that would dominate its surroundings. They didn't banish color. They adopted the vibrant hues of the sunrise, red, orange, maroon, as their uniform, a symbol of their supposed enlightenment that soon became perceived as the color of invasion. This is the almost unbelievable true story of how a tiny, remote Oregon town, population 40, found itself completely overrun, politically subjugated, and eventually targeted by a global spiritual movement led by a charismatic, perpetually silent guru and his ferociously ambitious chief lieutenant. It's the story of Rajneeshpuram, a utopian dream that rapidly morphed into a paranoid, heavily armed and criminally dangerous cult operating brazenly in plain sight. To understand the collision that occurred in the high desert of Oregon, one must first appreciate the tranquility that preceded it. Picture Antelope, Oregon, in the year 1981. Situated in the vast, sparsely populated, arid landscape of Wasco County in central Oregon, Antelope was geographically and culturally miles removed from the bustling cities of the Pacific Northwest. Calling it a town perhaps overstated its scale. It was fundamentally a speck on the map, a relic of a bygone homesteading era. Its official population hovered around 40 individuals, the vast majority being retirees living quiet lives, on fixed incomes, drawn to the area precisely for its profound isolation, stunning natural beauty, and extreme affordability. The town itself consisted of little more than 15 modest houses, a small community hall that doubled as an occasional church, a single, vital general store serving basic needs, and a post office acting as the primary link to the outside world. Civic life, such as it was, revolved around infrequent potluck dinners, town meetings focused on mundane matters like road maintenance, and the slow, predictable rhythms of rural existence. It was, by nearly all accounts, one of the quietest, most unassuming, and seemingly inconsequential corners of the entire United States. These 40 residents, enjoying their peaceful obscurity, their predictable routines, were utterly oblivious to the fact that halfway across the planet, in the sprawling, chaotic city of Pune, India, a highly controversial spiritual leader, already claiming divinity and commanding the absolute devotion of tens of thousands of followers worldwide, had, through his logistical planners, selected their remote, pristine valley as the divinely ordained location for his next most ambitious project, the creation of a self-sufficient, spiritually enlightened model city, a Buddha field built entirely from scratch in the American wilderness. His birth name was Chandra Mohan Jain, but by the 1970s, the world knew him primarily as Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, often referred to simply as Bhagwan, meaning Blessed One or God in Hindi. A former university philosophy professor possessing undeniable charisma and intellectual prowess, the Bhagwan had synthesized a unique, potent, and deeply controversial spiritual philosophy that proved intoxicating to a specific segment of the global population. He masterfully blended elements cherry-picked from Eastern mystical traditions, mindfulness techniques borrowed from Buddhism, meditation practices, the concept of ego dissolution, with fashionable Western psychotherapies, particularly the often confrontational and emotionally intense encounter group methods popular in the human potential movement. Perhaps most radically, and most appealingly to his Western audience, he aggressively rejected traditional religious notions, equating spirituality with asceticism, poverty, or the denial of worldly pleasures. The Bhagwan preached a doctrine of Zorba the Buddha, encouraging his followers to embrace life in its totality, to celebrate materialism as much as meditation, to pursue wealth as a sign of spiritual evolution, and, most notoriously, to view uninhibited sexuality not as sinful, but as a potentially powerful tool for transcending the ego and achieving spiritual awakening. Sex, within his complex and often contradictory teachings, could be reframed as a profound form of meditation, a path towards enlightenment. This unorthodox, permissive, and intellectually stimulating message resonated powerfully, not primarily with the impoverished or traditionally religious masses of India, but with a distinct and highly influential demographic, affluent, well-educated, often professionally successful Westerners, doctors disenchanted with conventional medicine, lawyers seeking deeper meaning beyond corporate practice, therapists exploring alternative modalities, academics questioning established paradigms, entrepreneurs looking for a spiritual justification for their wealth, primarily individuals from the United States, Western Europe, and Australia, flocked by the thousands to his burgeoning ashram in Pune, India, throughout the 1970s. They were often spiritually seeking, disillusioned with the perceived failures of both traditional religions and the counterculture movements of the 1960s, and deeply attracted by the Bhagwan's magnetic personality, his provocative lectures, and the radically permissive, often hedonistic, atmosphere of the ashram. In joining his movement, followers typically renounced their former identities, adopted new Sanskrit names given by the Bhagwan, donned clothing exclusively in the prescribed sunrise shades of red, orange, and maroon, and critically surrendered their worldly possessions, which often included substantial inheritances, properties, and life savings, directly to the Bhagwan and his rapidly expanding, highly organized foundation. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the Pune ashram had become a victim of its own success. It was dangerously overcrowded, attracting increasing hostility from the local Pune community and, more significantly, intense scrutiny from the Indian government. Authorities launched investigations into widespread allegations of rampant drug use within the ashram, questionable sexual practices, violations of currency laws, and most seriously, massive, systematic tax evasion by the Bhagwan's organization, which was accumulating vast, untaxed wealth from follower donations and various commercial enterprises. Facing mounting legal pressure, potential deportation, and logistical constraints, the Bhagwan recognized the urgent need for a new home base, a larger, more controllable territory where he could finally build his perfect city, far removed from the prying eyes, restrictive laws, and cultural conservatism of India. He needed a place where his new man could flourish. He needed Rajneeshpuram. The search for this promised land led his organizers, operating with meticulous planning and secrecy, to the vast, undeveloped rangelands of Central Oregon. In the summer of 1981, utilizing millions of dollars meticulously pooled from follower donations and channeled through a complex network of shell corporations designed to obscure the true buyer's identity, the Rajneesh organization successfully purchased the Big Muddy Ranch. This wasn't just any piece of land. It was a colossal, 64,000-acre cattle ranch encompassing a largely self-contained bowl-shaped valley, complete with its own water sources, a geographically strategic location, offering both isolation and significant potential for self-sufficiency. Its nearest neighbor, a factor likely viewed as insignificant by the planners, was the tiny, unassuming hamlet of Antelope, situated just 12 miles down a winding, dusty county road. The purchase, executed swiftly and quietly, marked the physical beginning of the invasion, a demographic and cultural shift that would irrevocably alter the landscape and lives of Central Oregon. Almost immediately after the deeds were signed, the transformation of the barren ranch land began at a breathtaking pace. Convoys of vehicles, predominantly painted red, carrying thousands of eager red-clad Sanniasins, began arriving. Fleets of heavy construction equipment, bulldozers, excavators, cranes, dump trucks, seemingly materialized overnight, rumbling through the once quiet valley. What had for generations been desolate cattle grazing land became, almost instantaneously, a frenetic, highly organized, 24-hour-a-day construction site operating on an industrial scale. The few residents of nearby Antelope watched, initially with curiosity, then bewilderment, and soon with growing alarm and outright fear, as a literal city, complete with infrastructure far exceeding anything previously seen in the region, began to rise impossibly fast from the high desert dust. Intriguingly, adding another layer to the unfolding drama, the Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh himself, upon his arrival in Oregon, amidst considerable fanfare within his movement, immediately took a public vow of silence. For the next 3 years, he would not utter a single word in public, communicating only through subtle nods, hand gestures, and occasional cryptic written notes, primarily interacting with his most trusted inner circle. He retreated into luxurious seclusion within the rapidly expanding compound, rarely seen even by the thousands of rank-and-file followers, toiling ceaselessly to build his city in the desert. Consequently, the public face, the administrative driving force, the sharp, uncompromising iron will behind the physical creation and political maneuvering of Rajneeshpuram, belonged entirely to his personal secretary, a young, fiery, intensely intelligent, and ruthlessly ambitious woman named Ma Anand Sheila. Sheila Silverman, born Sheila Patel in India, had received part of her education in the United States and possessed a keen understanding of both Eastern cultural nuances and Western administrative and legal systems. She was not, by nature or inclination, a spiritual figure focused on meditation or enlightenment. Sheila was the organization's pragmatic chief executive, its fiercely protective political strategist, its unapologetic enforcer. She commanded the movement's rapidly accumulating, vast international finances, personally directed the massive, complex construction project at Rajneeshpuram, and served as the Bhagwan's deliberately provocative and often abrasive mouthpiece to the increasingly hostile outside world. Where the Bhagwan, even in silence, projected an aura of serene, detached mysticism, Sheila radiated confrontational energy, sharp, often cutting, intelligence, and a profound, openly expressed disdain for anyone or any institution, be it local ranchers, state officials, or federal agencies, that dared to stand in the way of their divinely ordained mission. It quickly became terrifyingly clear to the original inhabitants of Oregon, particularly those in Antelope and Wasco County, that while the Bhagwan might represent the spiritual figurehead attracting followers and funds, it was Ma Anand Sheila who wielded the real temporal power, and she wielded it aggressively, strategically, and utterly without apology. The sheer scale and velocity of the development at Rajneeshpuram were unprecedented in Oregon's history, stunning state and local officials. Within an astonishingly short span of just 3 years, the highly skilled and motivated workforce of Sanniasins, including numerous architects, engineers, doctors, lawyers, and tradespeople, who applied their professional expertise for free as devotional service, transformed the barren cattle ranch into a remarkably sophisticated, fully functioning city, designed to eventually accommodate upwards of 50,000 permanent residents. Utilizing primarily modular construction techniques for speed, they erected thousands of individual A-frame houses and larger communal dwellings. They established a vast, technologically advanced agricultural operation, employing innovative irrigation and organic farming methods to make the arid land bloom, eventually producing enough food to feed the entire burgeoning population. They engineered and constructed vital infrastructure, including reservoirs, a complex water treatment system, a state-of-the-art power grid supplemented by solar energy, and significantly, their own paved airport complete with a hangar, capable of handling the private jets used by the Bhagwan and visiting dignitaries. Beyond basic infrastructure, they created a startlingly complete urban environment in the middle of nowhere. Commercial enterprises flourished within the city limits. A multi-story shopping mall featuring boutiques selling Rajneesh-branded clothing and books, diverse restaurants catering to various tastes, a hotel for visiting followers, even a licensed casino offering gambling opportunities. They established their own publishing house producing voluminous quantities of the Bhagwan's translated discourses, operated a modern medical clinic staffed by follower physicians, and maintained sophisticated communication systems. Demonstrating their ambition and disregard for external authority, they paved over 60 miles of roads within the ranch property. Furthermore, employing skilled legal maneuvering, they successfully petitioned Wasco County and the state of Oregon to officially incorporate Rajneeshpuram as a legal city, granting them powers of self-governance, including the right to establish their own planning commission, pass local ordinances, and critically, form their own police department. This last step proved particularly inflammatory. The establishment of the Rajneeshpuram Peace Force, uniformed, state-certified, equipped initially with standard police sidearms, but soon escalating to semi-automatic rifles, and even reportedly exploring the acquisition of Uzi submachine guns, sent shockwaves through the surrounding rural communities. These weren't just security guards, they were a private army, loyal solely to Ma Anand Sheela and the Bhagwan, operating under the color of state law within their own city limits. This visible paramilitary presence, combined with the constant, overwhelming influx of thousands of red-clad followers, exhibiting unconventional social behaviors. The Bhagwan's ostentatious, almost cartoonish, display of personal wealth, symbolized by his ever-growing collection of diamond-encrusted watches, and, most famously, his fleet of over 90 customized Rolls-Royce luxury automobiles, deeply unsettled and alienated the conservative, traditional, predominantly Christian residents of Wasco County, particularly the vulnerable 40 retirees residing in nearby Antelope. The clash was not merely inevitable, it was immediate and intense. A fundamental collision between radically different cultures, lifestyles, values, and competing visions for the future of the land. The long-time residents of Antelope and surrounding areas viewed the Rajneeshis not as peaceful spiritual seekers engaged in a legitimate religious experiment, but as noisy, arrogant, sexually deviant, disruptive invaders who were armed, seemingly contemptuous of local laws and customs, and rapidly overwhelming the region's limited resources and fragile social fabric. They worried intensely about the strain on groundwater supplies, the environmental impact of the unprecedented scale of development, the potential for crime spilling over from the commune, and the sheer, jarring cultural shock of encountering thousands of red-clad individuals, chanting and engaging in practices they found baffling and offensive. Reacting with the limited tools available to them, they turned to the established mechanisms of local governance, filing formal complaints about zoning violations related to the city's incorporation, lodging incessant noise complaints stemming from construction and large gatherings, launching legal challenges, questioning the legitimacy of Rajneeshpuram's city status, and petitioning the Wasco County Board of Commissioners to intervene and regulate the commune's explosive growth. They attempted, futilely, to use the familiar slow-moving rules and regulations of rural Oregon bureaucracy to contain the burgeoning, aggressive, and highly sophisticated city-state that had suddenly materialized in their backyard. Ma, Ann and Sheila, acting as the public face and chief strategist for the Rajneesh movement, treated these local efforts not just with dismissal, but with open, undisguised contempt. In numerous, widely publicized interviews and press conferences, she skillfully deflected questions about legal compliance while simultaneously mocking the Antelope residents and other local critics as ignorant, prejudiced bigots, portraying them as backward-thinking dinosaurs, desperately trying to resist an inevitable, enlightened future, represented by Rajneeshpuram. When pressed persistently by reporters about the escalating conflict, particularly regarding the desperate attempts by the original Antelope residents to legally disincorporate their own town to prevent being politically and demographically swallowed by the Rajneeshis, who were rapidly buying property within its limits, Sheila delivered her now infamous, chillingly pragmatic, and ultimately prophetic threat. If the town of Antelope continued to obstruct their plans, she declared coolly, the Rajneeshis possessed the financial resources and the will to simply buy the entire town. It wasn't intended as hyperbole or an idle boast. It was a clear statement of strategic intent. And so began the deliberate, methodical, and ruthlessly effective takeover of the town of Antelope. It unfolded with a chilling efficiency, a two-pronged assault employing overwhelming financial muscle alongside sophisticated, cynical manipulation of democratic processes. First came the economic siege. Acting under Sheila's direction, Rajneesh foundations and individual sannyasins, demonstrably flush with cash derived from the movement's global followers, descended upon the tiny town of Antelope. They systematically approached nearly every property owner, making cash offers significantly above market value, offers that the predominantly elderly, often low-income residents, simply couldn't realistically refuse. House by house, the small general store, vacant lots, essentially the entire physical fabric of the town, was purchased swiftly and legally. Within a remarkably short period, individuals wearing the distinctive red and orange hues of the Rajneesh movement became the clear majority property owners within Antelope's minuscule city limits. The original 40 residents, many having lived there their entire lives, suddenly found themselves strangers in their own hometown, surrounded, outnumbered, and deeply unnerved by thousands of followers of a charismatic guru and a cult whose practices and intentions they profoundly distrusted and feared. Second, and concurrent with the property acquisition, came the political coup. Manan and Sheila, demonstrating a keen, albeit cynical, understanding of Oregon's election laws regarding residency requirements, recognized a critical vulnerability in the town's minuscule population. If her followers could legally establish residency within Antelope's official boundaries, even temporarily, they could register to vote in Antelope's municipal elections. She orchestrated a calculated, strategic influx of hundreds of sannyasins, moving them from the main ranch complex into the houses and properties they now owned or rented within Antelope proper. In the spring of 1982, amidst intense local controversy and legal challenges, a special election was called to fill seats on the Antelope City Council. On election day, the Rajneeshis residing within the town limits voted as a perfectly disciplined, monolithic bloc, easily overwhelming the votes of the few remaining original residents. They captured every single available seat, seizing complete, legitimate political control of the town's government. Their very first official act, as the newly constituted Antelope City Council, was symbolic and devastating. By majority vote, they passed an ordinance to officially change the town's name, erasing its century-long identity from the map. The old, weathered highway signs bearing the name Antelope were ceremoniously taken down. New, professionally printed signs were promptly erected in their place. Antelope, Oregon, as a legal and political entity, ceased to exist. It was now, officially and jarringly, renamed Rajneeshpuram. The handful of remaining original residents were now living, legally and politically, inside the incorporated boundaries of a city bearing the name of the Indian guru, controlled entirely by his followers under the direction of Ma Anand Sheila. The localized invasion was complete. But Sheila's strategic ambitions, fueled by a potent combination of perceived divine mandate and personal power, stretched far beyond the confines of one tiny conquered town. Consolidating control over the tiny, effectively annexed municipality of Antelope Rajneeshpuram was merely a tactical victory for Mayan and Sheila. The true strategic prize, the key to securing Rajneeshpuram's long-term autonomy and unhindered expansion, lay in gaining control over the broader governing body, the Wasco County Board of Commissioners. If the Rajneeshis could capture a majority on this county board, they could dictate crucial land use policies favorable to their massive development plans, potentially control the county sheriff's department budget and priorities, influence judicial appointments, and effectively neutralize almost any external political or legal opposition to their burgeoning city-state. However, winning county-wide elections presented a far greater demographic challenge than overwhelming the tiny electorate of Antelope. It required mobilizing thousands more votes than the Sannyasins currently residing within Rajneeshpuram proper could muster. Sheila needed a massive, rapid influx of reliable voters, registered within Wasco County, before the next crucial election cycle. This political desperation, coupled with Sheila's characteristic ruthlessness and disregard for conventional ethics, led directly to one of the most audacious, bizarre, and ultimately catastrophic schemes in the cult's tumultuous history, the infamous Share-A-Home program. Launched with great public fanfare but sinister political intent in the summer of 1984. Under the guise of compassionate outreach, Sheila dispatched fleets of buses and teams of persuasive recruiters to major metropolitan centers across the United States, focusing particularly on skid rows and homeless shelters in cities like Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, Phoenix, and Seattle. Their explicit mission: recruit thousands upon thousands of homeless individuals, primarily single men, luring them with irresistible promises of free food, comfortable shelter, clean clothing, meaningful work, and a chance to build a new dignified life within the supposedly welcoming, utopian community of Rajneeshpuram. The recruitment drive was disturbingly successful. Over 6,000 destitute, vulnerable men and women, desperate for any escape from life on the streets, were persuaded by these promises and willingly transported across the country, often on grueling multi-day bus journeys, to the remote Oregon commune. Upon arrival, they were housed not in permanent structures, but primarily in hastily erected tents and basic temporary shelters within designated areas of the ranch. Sheila's administrative team provided them with basic necessities: food, clothing, rudimentary shelter, but also, according to numerous subsequent testimonies and investigative reports, freely distributed large quantities of beer and potent tranquilizing drugs, particularly Haldol, ostensibly to help them adjust to their new environment and manage pre-existing mental health or addiction issues. Critics, however, alleged this was a deliberate tactic to keep the potentially volatile population docile, manageable, and dependent. Critically, and central to the entire scheme, every single one of these newly arrived individuals, regardless of their mental state or understanding of the political process, was immediately registered to vote in Wasco County, their official address listed as Rajneeshpuram. Sheila explicitly intended to weaponize this imported electorate, this block of thousands of dependent voters, to decisively overwhelm the established local vote in the upcoming November 1984 county commissioner election, thereby seizing control of the county government through sheer, manufactured numbers. However, the inherently cynical and logistically flawed plan rapidly disintegrated into chaos. Attempting to integrate thousands of individuals suffering from complex issues like severe addiction, untreated mental illness, physical disabilities, and the deep traumas associated with chronic homelessness into the rigidly structured, highly demanding, and psychologically intense cultic environment of Rajneeshpuram proved utterly impossible. Conflicts immediately erupted between the often disoriented newcomers and the disciplined sannyasin workforce. Crime rates within the previously secure commune reportedly spiked, including thefts and assaults. The share-a-home residents proved difficult, if not impossible, to manage, resisted attempts at indoctrination, and perhaps most importantly from Sheila's perspective, showed little inclination to vote reliably according to her directives. Sheila quickly, pragmatically realized her high-stakes gambit had failed catastrophically. Her instantly manufactured army of voters was rapidly devolving into a dangerous, unpredictable liability, threatening the internal stability of Rajneeshpuram itself. Her solution to this self-inflicted crisis was as swift and ruthless as the initial recruitment drive. Just weeks before the crucial November election, with no warning, Sheila abruptly canceled the entire share-a-home program. The thousands of homeless people who had been lured across the country with promises of a new life were summarily rounded up, often against their will, and forcibly loaded back onto buses. These buses then drove them to nearby towns and cities throughout Oregon, Bend, Redmond, Portland, the Dalles, and unceremoniously dumped them back onto the streets, frequently in the middle of the night, often during freezing autumn weather, utterly abandoned with no money, no resources, no support system, and nowhere to go. The resulting humanitarian crisis, widely reported across the state, provoked outrage, further alienated the Rajneeshis from virtually all their Oregon neighbors, and drew sharp condemnation from state officials and social service agencies, left scrambling to assist those discarded by the cult. Sheila's cynical attempt to hijack the democratic process through demographic manipulation had backfired spectacularly, achieving nothing politically, while leaving a devastating trail of human misery, and significantly intensifying the external opposition to Rajneeshpuram. The Rajneeshpuram saga stands as a bizarre, almost surreal chapter in American history, a clash of cultures that escalated from political maneuvering to bioterrorism, ultimately imploding under the weight of its own internal conflicts and paranoia. It demonstrated how an organization, cloaked in the legitimacy of religion and utopian ideals, could wage war on its neighbors, operating far outside the bounds of law, in plain sight. But our final story tonight explores perhaps the most insidious and tragically common type of wolf that preys on American communities. This wolf doesn't arrive in a fleet of Rolls-Royces or preach a strange new doctrine. This wolf often arrives bearing gifts, jobs, prosperity, community development. This wolf wears the respectable suit of industry, promises progress, and builds the very foundations of the town it will eventually poison, often with the tacit complicity of ignorance or necessity from the community itself. This is the story of a corporate wolf, and the devastating, multi-generational betrayal it inflicted upon a town built entirely in its shadow, sustained by its payroll, and ultimately sacrificed on the altar of its profits. This is the story of Picher, Oklahoma. Picher, Oklahoma. Not as the desolate ghost town hauntingly depicted in modern photographs, but travel back through time to its zenith, the bustling, gritty decades spanning from its founding around 1913 through the mid-20th century. Imagine a landscape dominated not just by the vast, often unforgiving Oklahoma sky, but by the towering, skeletal silhouettes of mine headframes, the tipples constantly hoisting ore from the earth, and the ever-present, monolithic, unnatural mountains of accumulated mining waste. Located strategically in the far northeastern corner of Oklahoma, Picher wasn't merely part of the legendary Tri-State Mining District, a mineral-rich geological formation sprawling across Oklahoma, Kansas, and Missouri. For a significant period, it was the undisputed epicenter, the engine room, proudly and accurately proclaiming itself the lead and zinc capital of the world. This small town played an astonishingly outsized role on the global stage, its output critical to industrial development and military might far beyond its dusty borders. Picher was, in its very DNA, the quintessential company town, conjured into existence almost overnight, not by organic settlement, but by the discovery of exceptionally rich lead and zinc ore deposits, and brought to life almost entirely by the capital investment, industrial infrastructure, and corporate ambitions of powerful mining conglomerates, chief among them, the Eagle Picher Lead Company, an entity that would later evolve into the diversified Eagle Picher Industries. The company's influence wasn't merely significant, it was practically totalizing. It wasn't just the primary, overwhelming employer providing the vast majority of jobs that sustained the town's population. It effectively functioned as Picher's original architect, its primary landlord, its essential service provider, its economic lifeblood, and its de facto governing force for much of its history. Eagle Picher built the rows upon rows of modest but functional homes for its burgeoning workforce. Often rented at controlled rates, it funded directly or indirectly the construction of the schools where generations of miners' children received their education. It erected the local hospital that primarily served to patch up the frequent injuries inherent in the dangerous mining work and address the chronic illnesses exacerbated by environmental conditions. The company was Picher, and Picher in turn existed almost solely for the company's extractive purposes. The jobs it offered were notoriously grueling, physically demanding, and inherently perilous. Daily descents into dark, unstable, poorly ventilated tunnels deep underground, battling choking silica dust, the constant risk of sudden cave-ins, explosions from methane gas, and the long-term health consequences of heavy metal exposure. But these jobs represented a rare opportunity for steady, relatively well-paying work in a predominantly rural region, offering few comparable alternatives, allowing generations of families, many migrating from Appalachia or immigrating from Europe, to carve out a precarious but tangible living on the stark windswept Oklahoma plains. Despite the hardships and dangers, a fierce, undeniable pride permeated the Picher community. The miners, often forming tight-knit bonds forged in the shared adversity of the underground labyrinth, understood the vital importance of their labor on a scale far beyond their weekly paychecks. The lead painstakingly wrested from the rich tri-state ore deposits was an essential component for manufacturing batteries that powered vehicles and industries, formulating gasoline additives that boosted engine performance, producing durable paints and pigments, critically during global conflicts, forming the core of bullets and munitions. The zinc, extracted alongside the lead, was equally crucial for galvanizing steel, providing essential rust protection for everything from automobiles to infrastructure, and for manufacturing brass, a vital alloy for casings and machinery. During the immense industrial mobilizations required for World War I and, even more significantly, World War II, the mines honeycombing the earth beneath Picher operated at a frantic, non-stop pace, churning out strategic raw materials absolutely vital to the Allied war machine. Men worked exhausting double shifts, production quotas became paramount, and the entire town pulsed with a sense of urgent patriotic purpose, recognized nationally for its contribution. These weren't just miners digging rocks. They felt themselves to be essential cogs in the engine of American industry and defense, heroes on the home front. This deeply ingrained shared sense of contribution fostered a powerful, resilient community bond, a gritty, pragmatic pride born from shared sacrifice, collective effort, and a tangible connection to events unfolding on the world stage. However, this relentless industrial-scale extraction, this tearing of mineral wealth from the subterranean depths, inevitably generates an equally colossal byproduct: waste. For every single ton of valuable lead and zinc concentrate painstakingly separated and refined through the complex milling process, the operation left behind approximately 9 tons of crushed, mineral-depleted rock and sand. This waste material, known universally and colloquially throughout the tri-state district simply as chat, accumulated relentlessly, day after day, year after year, decade after decade, alongside the active mining operations. The sheer staggering scale of the accumulated waste almost defies easy comprehension. Over the lifespan of the intensive Picher area mining operations, stretching roughly from the early 1910s well into the 1970s, Eagle Picher and the numerous other smaller companies operating adjacent claims collectively generated an estimated, almost unimaginable, 178 million tons of this chat waste in the immediate geographical vicinity of the town itself. This colossal volume of industrial refuse wasn't discreetly buried in remote landfills or transported significant distances away, according to later environmental standards. It was simply piled up expediently and economically right next to the mines and mills, forming massive, steep-sided, unnatural mountains of gray, gravelly debris that completely encircled the town of Picher, fundamentally and permanently altering the relatively flat prairie landscape into something starkly alien, industrial, and ultimately toxic. These towering chat piles, some soaring over 200 feet high, taller than most buildings in the region, became the inescapable, dominant visual feature of Picher, stark man-made monuments casting long, literal shadows over the community living directly beneath them, and casting even longer, more insidious figurative shadows over its future health and viability. Eagle Picher, along with the other mining operators, faced a perpetual escalating challenge: how to manage this ever-growing physically imposing mountain range of industrial byproduct. Disposing of nearly 200 million tons of any material represents a significant logistical and financial burden. So, the company, consistently portraying itself as a responsible community partner, a benevolent provider, devised and promoted a solution that was presented as both pragmatic recycling and neighborly generosity. Instead of bearing the potentially enormous cost of safely containing, covering, or properly disposing of the chat according to evolving environmental understanding, the company embarked on a decades-long persistent public relations and operational strategy. They actively promoted the chat as safe, chemically inert fill material. Essentially, they rebranded toxic industrial waste as free, useful gravel. They not only encouraged its widespread use throughout the community, but often actively facilitated its distribution, providing company trucks and loading equipment to haul the chat away for various public and private construction projects. And this seemingly innocuous offer, this act cloaked in the guise of corporate generosity and responsible waste management, became the primary vector for a slow-motion, multi-generational poisoning, the central, devastating element of a profound toxic betrayal that would ultimately lead to Picher's complete annihilation. The most horrifying aspect of this file, hidden in plain sight, was that the danger wasn't some secret chemical buried deep underground and forgotten. It was piled hundreds of feet high in broad daylight, distributed freely with the company's blessing, and actively, enthusiastically integrated by the trusting community into the very foundations of their homes, schools, and daily lives. The residents of Picher, overwhelmingly employed by or economically dependent on Eagle Picher and its associated industries, largely accepted the company's repeated assurances of the chat's safety at face value. In a predominantly working-class town where financial resources were often scarce and construction materials represented a significant expense, the availability of unlimited quantities of free fill material was viewed as a substantial benefit, a welcome boon provided by the company that formed the bedrock of their economy. For generations, they unknowingly, incrementally built their lives, quite literally, upon and amidst the company's hazardous industrial leavings. Was a sturdy, level base needed for the high school's new running track, a necessary facility for student athletics, and a symbol of community pride. Tons of chat were readily hauled in, graded, and compacted. Did the town's growing churches require expansive parking lots to accommodate their Sunday congregations? Chat provided an inexpensive, readily available paving solution spread across acres. Did families need affordable fill material for landscaping their yards, creating raised garden beds, filling low spots, or establishing a solid, stable base for pouring concrete driveways, or even the very foundations of their modest homes? Chat, easily accessible and free for the taking from the omnipresent piles, was the ubiquitous, unquestioned answer. The town's basic infrastructure itself became fundamentally reliant on this toxic material. Countless miles of roads and sidewalks throughout Picher and the surrounding county were constructed over decades, using chat extensively as aggregate mixed into concrete and asphalt paving materials, embedding the poison directly into the town's circulatory system. And the children, growing up in this unique, almost lunar landscape where colossal, mountainous gray piles were simply accepted as natural features of their world, adapted with innocent ingenuity. The chat piles, despite their industrial origins and hazardous nature, inevitably became their unique, albeit treacherous, playgrounds. They treated the towering, unstable slopes as local adventure parks, challenging each other to races, riding battered bicycles up the inclines, picnicking on the summits that offered commanding, windswept views of their town nestled below in the shadow of the waste. They fashioned makeshift sleds from scavenged pieces of cardboard or sheet metal and careened gleefully down the steep, gravelly slopes, mimicking winter fun on sun-baked industrial refuse. Perhaps most tragically and dangerously, during the sweltering, humid Oklahoma summers, they sought relief from the heat by swimming, fishing, and playing in the often eerily turquoise or milky white ponds that collected acidic mine water runoff and rainwater in depressions at the base of the massive Chat Mountains, ponds that acted as settling basins, heavily laden with dissolved lead, cadmium, zinc, and other toxic heavy metals leached directly from the waste piles. They remained oblivious, shielded by a combination of misplaced trust in the company, a lack of accessible scientific information, and the normalization of their hazardous environment over generations, to the fact that they were immersing themselves daily in a pervasive toxic soup. The supposedly harmless gravel was, in scientific reality, a poorly contained hazardous waste repository. The milling process used to extract lead and zinc, while effective for its era, was inherently inefficient, leaving significant percentages of these toxic heavy metals chemically bound within the discarded waste rock. The chat was, therefore, saturated with lead, a potent neurotoxin scientifically proven for centuries to cause profound and irreversible neurological damage, posing the greatest risk to the vulnerable, rapidly developing brains and nervous systems of infants and young children. It also contained dangerously high concentrations of zinc and manganese, essential minerals required by the human body only in trace amounts, but toxic at the elevated levels found throughout Picher, capable of causing a range of neurological issues, mimicking Parkinson's disease and severe respiratory ailments. Furthermore, the chat harbored significant levels of cadmium, a heavy metal unambiguously classified as a Group 1 human carcinogen, by the World Health Organization and other international health agencies, strongly linked through decades of research to irreversible kidney damage, painful and debilitating bone diseases like Itai disease, and increased risks of developing various forms of cancer, particularly lung cancer when inhaled. The pathways for human exposure within Picher were relentless, unavoidable, and multifaceted. Gray dust constantly whipped from the unstable slopes of the chat piles by the strong Oklahoma winds wasn't just an aesthetic nuisance or a source of respiratory irritation. It was a toxic aerosol, carrying microscopic particles of lead, cadmium, zinc, and other metals directly into people's lungs with every breath. This dust blanketed the entire town, coating porches, windowsills, cars, playground equipment, and vegetable gardens. It inevitably infiltrated homes, settling invisibly on furniture, carpets, food preparation surfaces, and children's toys, tracked inside constantly on shoes and clothing, creating a persistent indoor exposure hazard. Rainwater, falling onto and percolating through the millions upon millions of tons of waste, became highly acidic due to sulfide minerals present in the ore, efficiently dissolving the toxic heavy metals contained within the chat. This resulting toxic leachate, a poisonous chemical soup, then contaminated the surface soil throughout Picher, poisoning the very ground where children played and families attempted to grow food. Critically, this contaminated water also seeped deep into the earth, polluting the relatively shallow Rubidoux aquifer, the primary source of private well drinking water for many Picher residents for decades, effectively delivering the dissolved heavy metals directly into their kitchen taps and bathtubs. Lead poisoning, in particular, operates with cruel stealth, earning its historical moniker as the silent epidemic. Unlike acute poisonings with immediate dramatic symptoms, chronic low-level lead exposure often manifests subtly, easily mistaken for other childhood issues, yet its long-term impact is devastating and permanent. It accumulates silently within the body, primarily sequestered in bones and teeth, where it can remain dormant for decades, only to be slowly released back into the bloodstream during periods of physiological stress like pregnancy or illness, continuing to exert its toxic effects long after the initial exposure has ceased. Its primary target is the central nervous system, particularly in children whose brains are undergoing rapid development. Even exposure levels once considered safe by regulatory agencies are now scientifically understood to cause measurable, permanent reductions in IQ scores, contribute significantly to lifelong learning disabilities, impair executive functions like attention and impulse control, increase the likelihood of developing aggressive or antisocial behaviors, cause hearing loss, and delay physical growth and development. Higher levels of exposure, tragically common in Picher, can lead to more acute symptoms including severe abdominal pain, seizures, irreversible kidney damage, coma, and in extreme cases, death. The most damning indictment in the Picher tragedy lies not just in the devastating health consequences, but in the irrefutable evidence of corporate knowledge and deliberate inaction. The file detailing Eagle Picher's awareness wasn't buried from them. Subsequent lawsuits filed by affected residents and extensive federal investigations conducted under the Superfund program unearthed a disturbing trail of internal company memoranda, commissioned scientific reports, risk assessments, and inter-office correspondence dating as far back as the 1930s. These documents demonstrated conclusively that high-level corporate officials and company scientists were acutely aware, decades before the crisis became public, of the significant health risks posed specifically by lead dust exposure in mining operations and, critically, by the heavy metal contamination present in their chat waste. They understood the basic science. They recognized the potential for widespread environmental contamination and human harm. Yet, for decades, driven primarily by the immense profitability of the tri-state mining operations, The company prioritized production quotas and cost-cutting measures over implementing adequate safety protocols or investing in responsible waste management. They actively downplayed the risks, resisted emerging environmental regulations, continued piling up the toxic chat adjacent to residential areas, and, most culpably, actively promoted and distributed this hazardous material as safe for community use. The systematic poisoning of Picher wasn't merely an unfortunate industrial accident. It was the known, foreseeable, and ultimately accepted consequence of a corporate culture that prioritized billions in revenue over the fundamental health and well-being of the very community whose dangerous labor generated that wealth. The long-delayed reckoning, when it finally began to dawn, arrived not with a sudden dramatic whistleblower exposé, but through the slow, methodical, and often bureaucratic scrutiny of nascent environmental science and newly enacted federal regulations. The landmark creation of the Superfund program in December 1980, catalyzed directly by the public horror and political fallout surrounding the Love Canal disaster in New York, fundamentally changed the landscape of industrial accountability in America. This legislation empowered the recently formed Environmental Protection Agency with the authority and, crucially, the funding mechanism to investigate, prioritize, and compel the remediation of the nation's most dangerously contaminated hazardous waste sites. Given its notorious history, visible environmental scars, and known concentration of heavy metal mining, the infamous Tri-State Mining District, with Picher at its heart, was inevitably identified as an obvious high-priority early target for Superfund investigation. EPA investigators and environmental scientists arriving in Picher in the early 1980s encountered an environmental catastrophe potentially exceeding even the scale of Love Canal. The sheer physical magnitude of the chat piles, dominating the horizon for miles, was visually overwhelming. But the truly shocking discovery lay in how deeply and pervasively this visibly toxic material had been integrated into the fabric of daily life, used in roads, foundations, playgrounds, yards. They initiated a comprehensive, multi-year process of rigorous environmental testing. Soil samples collected systematically from residential yards, school grounds, public parks, and alongside roads revealed lead concentrations hundreds, often thousands of times higher than levels considered safe for human habitation. Analysis of surface water in the creeks, streams, and the ubiquitous, deceptively inviting chat pile ponds confirmed dangerously elevated levels of dissolved lead, cadmium, zinc, and other heavy metals, posing risks through ingestion and skin contact. Crucially, systematic testing of the shallow Rubidoux aquifer, the primary source of private well-drinking water for a significant portion of Picher's residents over decades, confirmed widespread, severe contamination, indicating that families had been unknowingly ingesting poisoned water for years. But the most heartbreaking, scientifically irrefutable, and politically galvanizing evidence emerged from the parallel public health studies conducted alongside the environmental assessments. Working collaboratively with the Indian Health Service and state health departments from Oklahoma, Kansas, and Missouri, officials began the difficult but necessary process of systematically testing the blood lead levels, particularly of Picher's children, the population most vulnerable to lead's devastating neurological effects. The findings, when released publicly, constituted nothing less than a confirmed public health emergency of staggering proportions. Initial studies, followed by more comprehensive and targeted testing over several years, consistently revealed epidemic levels of lead poisoning throughout the community's youth. While the Centers for Disease Control's recognized level of concerns for lead in a child's blood is 5 micrograms per deciliter, studies conducted in Picher during the 1980s and 90s revealed that over 34%, and in some later studies approaching 40%, of the children tested exceeded this critical threshold. A statistic utterly catastrophic in its implications for a generation's cognitive potential and long-term health. Worse still, numerous children were found with blood lead levels considered acutely dangerous, exceeding 70, 80, even reaching over 100 micrograms per deciliter, levels demanding immediate aggressive medical intervention to prevent severe permanent brain damage or even death. The abstract, environmental danger represented by the omnipresent gray mountains had tragically, undeniably materialized within the bloodstreams and developing brains of Picher's youngest, most vulnerable residents. This confirmed a devastating multi-generational public health disaster, directly and scientifically linked to the pervasive heavy metal contamination originating from the mining waste that the community had been encouraged to embrace as a harmless gift. As if the slow, insidious poisoning of its population wasn't a sufficient existential threat, Picher began to face a second, terrifyingly tangible crisis in the 1990s and early 2000s. The very ground beneath the town, honeycombed by decades of aggressive room and pillar mining, was literally starting to give way. This mining technique involved extracting ore by carving out vast underground caverns or rooms, leaving behind only pillars of the remaining rock, often spaced according to engineering calculations of the time, to support the immense weight of the earth and the entire town built above. For more than half a century, Picher had existed, unknowingly to most residents, precariously balanced atop this fragile, man-made subterranean void, a landscape riddled with hundreds of miles of unmapped, decaying tunnels. Now, decades after the main mining operations ceased in the 1970s, the geological stresses were finally reaching a breaking point. Factors like groundwater infiltration weakening the support pillars, the natural settling of the earth, vibrations from remaining mine traffic, or even distant seismic activity, and possibly illegal secondary robbing of remaining pillars by scavengers seeking leftover ore, all contributed to the increasing instability. The underground structure, never designed for indefinite permanence, began to fail catastrophically. Massive, terrifying sinkholes and subsidences started appearing throughout Picher and the surrounding mined areas, often with little or no warning. These weren't minor potholes or gentle settling, they were sudden, violent implosions of the Earth's surface into the voids below. News reports and resident accounts from the period documented streets abruptly collapsing, swallowing utility lines, water mains, sewer pipes, gas lines, creating immediate public safety hazards. Buildings, both homes and businesses, began to show severe structural damage, foundations cracking, walls buckling, floors tilting precariously as the ground shifted beneath them. The high school athletic field, ironically located near some of the most extensively mined areas, suffered significant, dramatic collapses, rendering it permanently unusable and serving as a stark visual symbol of the town's precarious foundation. In perhaps the most widely publicized incident, illustrating the imminent danger, a resident's car was nearly consumed entirely when a sinkhole 60 feet wide suddenly opened up directly in the path of their vehicle on one of Picher's main streets. The driver miraculously escaped just moments before their car would have plunged into the newly formed abyss. Picher was now officially condemned by two distinct, equally lethal environmental factors: the pervasive, inescapable heavy metal contamination of its air, water, and soil rendered it profoundly toxic and incompatible with safe human habitation, particularly for children. Simultaneously, the accelerating, unpredictable geological instability caused by the collapsing mine workings beneath made the physical occupation of the town increasingly perilous, threatening catastrophic structural failures at any moment. The town was, in the stark, unavoidable assessment of federal engineers and environmental scientists, fundamentally incompatible with continued human life. The true, devastating, long-term cost of Eagle Picher's century of profitable resource extraction was not just poisoned bodies and damaged mines, but a landscape literally consuming itself, erasing the very ground upon which the community stood. Faced with this unprecedented dual catastrophe, extreme toxicity combined with catastrophic geological instability, the federal government, primarily through the EPA, and later the Army Corps of Engineers, arrived at a grim, unavoidable conclusion in the early 2000s. Unlike Love Canal, where containment and targeted relocation were deemed feasible, Picher could not be effectively remediated. The contamination was too widespread, too deeply integrated into the town's fabric, and the collapsing ground made any large-scale cleanup effort both technically infeasible and prohibitively dangerous. The town could not be saved. The file was too toxic, too broken. The only viable, responsible option, however heartbreaking, was total abandonment. Erasure. Starting formally around 2006, though discussions and preliminary offers began earlier, the United States government initiated an extraordinary, almost unprecedented action, a total, mandatory, federally funded buyout of virtually the entire town of Picher, Oklahoma, along with the adjacent, similarly affected small communities of Cardin and Treese, Kansas. Utilizing Superfund money and special congressional appropriations, the government systematically offered to purchase every single occupied home, every functioning business, every standing church, effectively condemning the entire incorporated area. While technically voluntary, the overwhelming environmental hazards and collapsing infrastructure left residents with little realistic choice but to accept the government's offer. The process was lengthy, complex, emotionally fraught, and often bureaucratic. Residents, many of whom had lived in Picher their entire lives, whose families had worked the mines for generations, were forced to negotiate the value of homes that were now officially worthless, located in a town deemed uninhabitable. They had to navigate the immense personal trauma of leaving behind, not just houses, but a lifetime of memories, community connections, and deeply rooted identities tied to a place that was literally disappearing beneath their feet. They became, in effect, internally displaced persons, environmental refugees within their own homeland, forced out not by war, famine, or natural disaster in the traditional sense, but by the slow-motion, man-made disaster created by the toxic legacy of a corporation that had built their town, employed their families, and ultimately destroyed their future. The company primarily responsible, Eagle Picher, had already undergone significant restructuring and facing mounting liabilities from Picher and numerous other environmental contamination sites across the country, predictably filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in 2005. While complex legal settlements eventually allocated some funds towards the Picher buyout and remediation efforts, the amount represented only a small fraction of the true, multi-billion-dollar cost of the environmental destruction and the immeasurable human toll. Through the legal shield of bankruptcy, the primary wolf largely escaped meaningful long-term financial accountability for the obliteration of an entire community. The profits had been privatized decades earlier. The devastating costs were socialized, borne by the residents and the American taxpayer. Today, Picher, Oklahoma, officially no longer exists as a functioning town. The zip code has been deactivated. Mail delivery ceased years ago. The last few determined residents who initially refused to leave were eventually forced out by deteriorating conditions or final government actions. Federal contractors continue the slow, hazardous, multi-decade process of demolishing the remaining thousands of abandoned structures, attempting to mitigate ongoing environmental hazards and trying, perhaps futilely, to reclaim small portions of the poisoned landscape. All that remains visible now is the ghostly, overgrown grid of empty streets leading nowhere, punctuated by crumbling foundations and dominating the horizon, the silent, immutable gray mountains of Chat, permanent, toxic monuments standing guard over the grave of a town, built, poisoned, and ultimately erased for profit. The wolf wears many faces, often masks of normalcy and trust. Sometimes, It's the town bully like Ken McElroy, weaponizing brute force and fear, until a desperate community takes justice into its own bloody hands, creating a legacy of silence. Sometimes, it's the prophet like Warren Jeffs, twisting faith into an invisible cage, demanding absolute obedience, and sacrificing the innocence of children for perceived divine favor and earthly power. Sometimes, it's the invading utopia, the followers of Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, promising enlightenment and community, while plotting political takeover, unleashing biological terror, and demonstrating a chilling disregard for their neighbors. Quick visual reminder of Rajneeshpuram, and sometimes, as the heartbreaking true stories of Love Canal and Picher so devastatingly illustrate, the wolf is the trusted provider. The friendly corporation, the engine of the local economy, building lives and communities while knowingly, systematically burying poison beneath playgrounds, distributing toxic waste as gifts, operating in plain sight while prioritizing profit over human life itself. These are the files, often hidden not by elaborate conspiracy, but by community dependence, by regulatory failure, by the normalization of danger, by the simple, powerful act of looking the other way. These are stories of profound betrayal, stories where the crime scene isn't a single room, but an entire town, an entire way of life irrevocably damaged. These are the narratives of true crime that extend beyond individual acts, exposing systemic failures and the devastating consequences when power, whether wielded by an individual, a cult, or a corporation, operates without meaningful accountability. The truth demands to be seen. These histories must not be forgotten, lest their patterns repeat. But unearthing these buried truths requires collective vigilance. It needs your voice, your attention, to keep the pressure on, to ensure these stories resonate. If you believe these deep dive investigations serve a vital purpose, if you agree that these complex, often uncomfortable true stories must continue to be told, please take a moment to like this video. Your simple click is a powerful signal to the algorithms and to others that uncovering hidden truths, understanding systemic failures, and demanding accountability genuinely matters. Which of these 4 disturbing cases, these examples of communities held hostage, resonated most deeply with you? What crucial details might we have overlooked in our investigation? And perhaps most importantly, what other vital files, what other stories of power abused in plain sight, are still buried, waiting to be brought into the light? Share your valuable thoughts, your critical insights, and your crucial suggestions for future investigations in the comments section below. This channel grows stronger through your engagement and direction. And finally, to ensure you are among the first notified when we unearth and meticulously examine the next buried file, please subscribe to Plain Sight Docs and make absolutely sure you click that notification bell. Your support allows us to continue this critical work. Thank you for watching. Stay aware, stay vigilant.